Welcome to our new class that is focused on the Beatitudes. At the end of the Lord's Prayer classes, I put it out there to see if anyone had any specific topics, and this came back multiple times. It's not going to be a long session this time because the Beatitudes, while they're connected to a lot of different things themselves, it's only 12 verses or so. So this will be a 3-session class. And in fact, I'll show you what the sessions look like real quick here. Not that one. That's not the one I wanted. So let's see here. But it's a 3-session class. And it keeps coming up to that. I don't know why. All right, well, this first class will be focusing on an introduction and context, because that really is so crucial. And while this class will not be so much like heavy reading like Lord's Prayer was, there's a lot of contextual reading you can do. And I do feel that as you go through this, particularly in Matthew, you will benefit by doing some of that contextual reading. Basically, some of the stuff that appears mostly before what we see in the Beatitudes. I may be skipping a week. I'll let you know. On the 25th, we have some things happening in the morning, and it all depends on some timing here. So, but otherwise, it's a 3-session class on the Beatitudes. Now, we have all, at some point in our lives, heard of the Beatitudes. And what is a beatitude? You know, just at basic level, it comes from the Greek word, which I'm not going to pronounce it right, but it's makaroi, and it means blessing. And then in the 4th century, the Jerome, who was writing the Latin version of the Bible, kind of took that word and put a positive spin on it, because the Latin word beati it means not just blessing, but it means like happy are or rich are. And it added this sort of more positive, lifted view of the Beatitudes. And that really does impact. Here, I'm going to ask if I forgot to ask, and I'm just going to mute everybody here. But it impacts our sense of the meaning. So we're going to get into that. We're going to get into, you know, what the meaning of the Beatitudes is, or just the nature of the word itself. But this style of writing, this style of presenting things, it's very common throughout the Hebrew scriptures. So you'll see a lot of this type of stuff in the Psalms, in Proverbs, in Jeremiah, in Isaiah, in so many different places, and in Ruth. So I listed some of those in the notes so you can kind of check it out. But it's a very well-known style of communication. So that's kind of basically what a beatitude is. And what's the context? Why is Jesus saying it where he does? Well, in Matthew, and that's really going to be our focus. We're going to talk about both Matthew and Luke, because that's where the 2 places where the Beatitudes appear. But in Matthew, it's part of the larger Sermon on the Mount, and that's chapters 5 through 7 in Matthew. And what we've seen just before the Sermon on the Mount is very crucial in terms of our understanding of the actual Sermon on the Mount. And in a lot of ways, people have noted this, that the Gospel of Matthew is kind of like, it's the way it starts is kind of like a beginner's guide to understanding Jesus. And so these first 4 chapters that Matthew gives us are all these different things that help us understand, you know, who Jesus was, where he came from, how he was born, how he engaged with different people, you know, how he treated John the Baptist, how he handled evil and the devil in the temptation story. All these different pieces that are sort of given to us in a very tight format that help orient us to who Jesus is and what it will look like as followers of him. But also, the first 4 chapters are sort of like a prelude to understanding what will come in the Sermon on the Mount. And the Beatitudes is that first section of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, we're not going to do the whole Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes is what we'll focus on this time. Maybe we'll continue the Sermon on the Mount another time. But so when you look at some of the themes that are brought up in the first 4 chapters, here's an example. The theme of righteousness. Matthew, one of the Beatitudes is blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Okay, that sort of thing. So we hear that in the Beatitudes, but really in the first 4 chapters, we've been giving all this information that should help orient our understanding of what that looks like. So for instance, that first portion of Matthew that most of us skip because it's just too long and we don't know the meaning of these stories. We would do well to learn the meaning of these stories because there are 4 women, for example, that are mentioned in that genealogy. So that would be Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. And these are all women who act in a way of higher righteousness, because of the surprising ways that they helped continue the story of Israel and make it, instead of stopping where it might not have gone on, because of their actions, things moved forward. And it was their righteousness that enabled that to happen. We learn about in the first 4 chapters, Joseph. He's named as one who is seen as righteous in the eyes of God. And the way Joseph acts is pretty powerful, because he knows that his betrothed is pregnant with a child that is not his. And he acts in righteous ways to care for her, to not act on that sort of knowledge that he has, even though he's, it's mistaken, but that's what he understands in that time. According to Matthew, he takes them and protects them by going to Egypt afterwards and coming back and settling in Nazareth instead of Bethlehem to protect them from the census that happens. All these ways that Joseph acts as a righteous man. And then there's John the Baptist in the way that he talks to Jesus and says, when I'm asking you to baptize me, when Jesus says to him, you need to baptize me because that is what will fulfill all righteousness. This sense of who John is, of how people act in relation to Jesus, it sort of sets up these chords that help us understand what Matthew later means, or what Jesus later means when he talks about some of these Beatitudes. So there's context that's provided for all the Beatitudes in those first 4 chapters. So aside from what we're going to read today, which is just the Beatitudes themselves, I really would advise you to go back and read the first 4 chapters of Matthew. Just have that stuff in mind. And what's really kind of cool is as we go through the Beatitudes, and then you go back and read the first 4 chapters, you will see a lot of new insights, a lot of new information will come up. It will, all of a sudden you'll see like, oh my gosh, I hadn't really noticed that before, but now I see it. I see more of the connections. And this is what we talk about. One of the reasons why Bible study is so crucial is that it helps us connect the threads of the greater stories, because the way we tend to read the Bible is so microscopic. It's so episodic. It's not as connected. So Bible study allows us those chances to make those connections where we might otherwise just miss them or forget them. Okay, so that's some of the context. And then the last thing I want to say, or one of the last things, is why is it that this Sermon on the Mount, why is it that it happens on a mountain? And, one of the things, if you remember from our study of the Gospel of Matthew, it's that Matthew sets up Jesus as the new Moses. Okay, there's a distinct connection between the truth and the way that Jesus is presented as the conveyor of God's new covenant, new way. It's a Moses connection. Okay, so Moses on Mount Sinai is what should be in mind when we see some of these events. And did you know that if you counted the various episodes throughout the Gospel of Matthew that appear on a mountain, there are 7 total? Well, that's a very significant number. 7 different episodes throughout the Gospel of Matthew that appear on a mountain, all of which communicate the way that Jesus is sort of like the new Moses. Okay, so that's a big part of this. And then the last thing I want to say is, when you read through the chapters 5 to 7, it's kind of like back in the day when you used to see those ads from K-Tel that would do those like greatest hits albums from the 70s or the 80s or something. I've heard someone say that the Sermon on the Mount is kind of like, think of it as a greatest hits of Jesus. It wouldn't be one long sermon. It wouldn't be one long presentation. It's just too much. It's too rich. It would be too much to digest in one sitting. but it really represents the totality, and I'm talking about the entire Sermon on the Mount, not just the Beatitudes, but it all represents sort of the totality of here is what Jesus represents in a sort of summary version, in the best of our understanding of him. That's kind of what the Sermon on the Mount tries to communicate. So in that sense, the Beatitudes try to communicate that sort of broader vision that taps into Jesus' presentation of what's important to God. Okay, so that's what we should try to keep in mind when we read the Beatitudes. What is it that's trying to be communicated here? What is it that Jesus is telling us? What is God trying to communicate, not only to the people back then, but really to any of us today? That's sort of my initial comments there. Anyone else have any comments or questions about your connection to or experience with the Beatitudes previously, or anything that I've said that you have questions or comments about? And don't forget to unmute yourself if you want to say something. Barb Tellman and then Horty.
Well, in my long and varied path through Christianity, at one point, I was taught that the Beatitudes are the Be-attitudes. And I'm sure others have been taught that too, or have learned that at some point in their history.
Well, it's true. And so what we do often is we approach the Beatitudes with that sort of, we find ways to use mnemonic devices to help memorize them, to help them become a part of our consciousness. And yet I find, at least in my experience, that I have ended up more or less struggling to find a deeper connection to the Beatitudes. It's made it a bit of a more cursory appreciation of them in the way that they've been presented to me so far, in particularly through church and, say, schooling, like church school, or even when I went to Catholic high school. Okay, so yeah, but yeah, we hear them, that Beatitudes, different things that we've been taught. But then again, if it helps us to remember them, even just to commit them to memory, that's a start. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it sometimes ends there. Horty, did you have something you wanted to add?
It was exactly the same thing. And the emphasis was maybe less superficial than at first, but in having considered it, what does it really mean to be the attitudes that are portrayed in them? How do I be that? How do I apply that to myself?
I think that's part of what we will try to do with this class, is really look more deeply at them and see how it is that these might interact in our lives, how they might connect to our lives. What does it mean, for example, to be blessed? What does that really mean when we say that? And to look a little bit more deeply at what they're trying to communicate. Because I think as I've been going through this, I've had a lot of assumptions about what they are, what I've been told they mean, and what they perhaps much more deeply mean. So we'll get into some of that. Patty?
I was thinking about your sermon on Sunday and how Matthew is a witness, martyr, witness, and that these are his understanding of how he knows Jesus, that his witness to Jesus. And thinking of what a witness is, a witness has a part of the truth and part of the untruth. And that's the context that I see this, and look into it. Then what we do also becomes witness.
And what I love about it, and I agree, I think it is sort of Matthew's way of interpreting the scriptures. He's taking a lot from the Hebrew scripture here and putting it forward and interpreting it into a new light. And that's really what Jesus did. Matthew's doing the same kind of work. He's not presenting it necessarily as this is the be all end all, but Luke tries to do that. Luke makes it like, no, everyone else presented their stuff, but mine's more organized, and here's the way it's going to be understood. Look, the truth is, all all of them have their own perspective, their own agenda, their own way of telling the story, and utilizing different pieces in order to communicate certain things. Matthew's way of doing it is this, sort of summarizing the first 4 chapters, presenting these greatest hits in the next couple chapters, and then getting into some more specific details, but really setting up the hearers or the readers to sort of get, okay, brass tacks, when we get down to it, this is what I think Jesus is all about. Okay, and this is how Jesus connects to our story, our history. I mean, just read through the genealogy again. Matthew is trying to be so deliberate to symbolically connect Jesus to those ancients, to the ancient prophets, to the most important movements through the history of Israel, in order to establish that he is legitimately the Messiah that they've been expecting all these years. He's very much connecting Jesus to that ancient Jewish expectation, or that rolling. Now, that shifts in terms of what he actually does to fulfill that role. But Matthew is very intentional about trying to set this up and tell a story that connects Jesus to that greater story that they have all been swimming in for so long. And I think it's important to know that, or to recognize that, because a lot of us, when we think of Matthew, we think of, well, Matthew's in part about how Jesus talked to the Jews first and they rejected him, so then he moved on to the Gentiles. That might not be your impression, but that's a lot of people's impression, that Matthew sort of moved past them and it's like, well, sorry, you had your shot, you're out. And that's not at all what Matthew's about. It's not at all. But a lot of us in our upbringing, and we sort of receive some of these messages that the Gospels, said it, it was the children of Israel first, and then sorry, they didn't accept it, so we move on. That kind of thing is much deeper than that. It's much deeper than that. But as Patty was saying, this is a particular way of presenting the story from Matthew's vantage point, and also Luke. But we'll be focusing more on Matthew here, just because of the way it's a little bit, the way it's presented, I think, is more useful for our purposes. Any other questions or comments about your experience or your attitude about the Beatitudes? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Bonnie. Yeah.
The word blessed, so often, I think when we think that we're having problems or it's a tough time or something, then we think, well, we are blessed because of these other good things are going on in our life. We're healthy or whatever it is, And I'm wondering if at the time that Jesus said this to who he was preaching to, the Sermon on the Mount, if they were somehow struggling with some of that same set of circumstances, that maybe things were not going so well, maybe you think about Moses and the children of Israel, sort of complaining in the wilderness. Well, but they weren't in slavery anymore. So in that sense, they were blessed. And I'm just wondering if some of that might have been going on at the same time.
I think you're raising a great point, Bonnie. It's not necessarily only about the blessed part, but each one of the Beatitudes. And look, there's an argument as that, are there 8? Are there 9? Are there 10? It's most widely agreed that there are 8 because the last 2 that, they're sort of the same thing. Blessed are you who are persecuted. But anyway, it has to do with the blessing and what they're going through. And you're right. There's something universal about what they all speak to. But there's also something very specific, that Jesus is speaking in a time where, if you look at the history, roughly when, the time of Jesus preaching and sharing that story, it was a difficult time in terms of the relationship between Israel and Rome, and the puppet leaders that they had, and trying to make Israel sort of fit and fall in line with the Roman expectation and all that, and the pressure that created, and the ways that the larger economy was coming down on the small farmers and the small sort of business owners that were sort of part and parcel to what, the bread and butter of Israel. So there's a lot of pressures from a lot of different sectors at this time that created a lot of the issues that the Beatitudes speak to. But let's face it, they're also all universal. So it's really, that's why it's so lasting, because it's very specific, but it's also universal. And as we look at these, I think you will certainly find your own experience and expression of each one of these. But the point is that I hope that in our work together, it will deepen the appreciation, and you will find yourself immersed in that greater community that this is intended for. Because again, it's not just for the audience that Jesus was speaking to on the Mount, not just the disciples, not just the early church, but it's to humanity. It's to our sense of what it means to be alive in this world. And Jesus is creating a new sense of family, a new sense of community. So the Beatitudes sort of reflect, what will this look like? What are the things that are of ultimate concern? This is what the Gospels are so much focused on. This is what we are about. Okay, so as we look at the Beatitudes, this will come up. Without any other questions or comments, why don't we just go ahead and do that? We'll read through both Matthew and the Luke versions. Could I get 2 volunteers? Since there are only, like 12 verses or 6 to 12 verses each one, could I just get 1 volunteer for the Matthew and 1 volunteer for the Luke? Okay, Carol, will you do Matthew? And drum roll, Marilyn will do Luke. Thank you. I know that's exciting watching for those who are going to be checking this out online. Let's see. Here we go. Carol, go for it. If you've started, Carol, I can't hear you. So unmute. Still muted.
When Jesus
There we
saw
go.
the crowds, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you."
Wonderful. Thank you. And now the Luke version, which is a little different.
Blessings and woes. And you can hear me, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets."
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, just initial impressions on those 2 readings. Anything stand out to you? Anything cause you a little concern or a little, a thorn in your side as you hear that? Carol?
Well, I was immediately, as soon as Marilyn started saying, woe to you, woe
Mhm.
to you,
Mhm.
you're uplifted, blessed, blessed, blessed. And then it was, whoa, whoa, whoa.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a real shift there.
It is a real shift, and I knew that would come up because it's so true, and that's one of the reasons why the Luke version can be challenging to some. But here's what I want to offer: when you hear the word "woe," we think of as almost like a lightning strike. It's like it's a real foreboding kind of thing. But think of it more along the lines of when you're on a horse and you say "whoa." It's more like hold up now, okay? Don't get all high on your high horse, because those who are laughing now, you're going to be crying too. You know what I mean? It's Luke's way of trying to remind us of the balance that is a part of life, and that how it rains, that old expression that it rains on the fields of the righteous and on the fields of the unrighteous at the same, that at different times in our lives we receive blessing, at different times we are laughing, at different times we experience sadness and mourning. So it can feel like this sort of judgmental thing, and it may have that in part, but I just want to offer that the word woe is also one that's a reminder to check oneself, to have a broader perspective here, lest we fall into this trap. And here's one that ask yourselves: the trap that sometimes we end up approaching life as if it is our right to be happy, or it is our right to be joyful all the time. Or on the other hand, maybe we feel like the way life has treated us, that it's our lot in life to be sad, or that things just don't work out. You see what I'm saying? Whatever we get ourselves stuck in, Luke is trying to remind us, whoa, hold up, okay? There's a fuller picture here to stay in tune with. Matthew presents it in a similar way. It just doesn't sort of strike us as that whoa kind of, that holds us, that like can startle us in a sense. So in some ways, Luke's is effective in that way. But I also like the way that I like the way both of them present it. But Luke uses it a little differently in his version than Matthew does. Any other questions or comments about just the sound or the way they're presented, Marilyn?
Well, it was quite interesting to read the Luke and become even more aware of the great big difference.
Yes, yeah.
The blessed and the woe. And there are some ways in which, for me, it kind of fits where I am in this particular time of ours.
Yes,
That
yes.
there are my own life is at the blessed end.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so much in the larger life, in the country and the world, and what's going on in India, for example, and that's just the opposite, and can kind of remind me that I'm even more blessed because that hasn't happened to me, at least yet.
Well, and this is where we're going to talk about, what is blessing? When we say, like in Matthew in particular, because it talks about it so continually, but when we say blessed are, when we say blessed, what does that mean? What does it mean within us? But what does it really mean? What Matthew's saying. We hear that and we think what? When it says blessed are, one of the things we hear is what Marilyn just shared. And I'm not pinning this on you, but you just lifted that up, Marilyn. That idea of being blessed is that we are free from some of the that we are not necessarily experiencing some of the hardships, that we are lifted out. I don't know if that's exactly how you would say it, but that we're experiencing some type of goodness in our lives right now, that we're not feeling the opposite of the goodness. I don't know. It's really it's so general. Can you reiterate what you would mean then when you say being blessed, Marilyn, based on what you just shared? What does it mean for you to be blessed?
Well, I think what I'm thinking of right now, and a lot of it is contextualized by by the other things that are going on. So blessed might mean different things at different times. But I think for me right now, it's that, I'm surrounded by love. I live in a beautiful place. I have experiences like this right now.
Mm-hmm.
And just sort of a lot of, if I were going to think of how the good and the not so good are balanced in my life, the good is up higher
Mm-hmm.
now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for lifting that up. Anyone
Does
else?
that help? I don't know.
No, it does. I know it's hard. That's why I was having trouble describing it, because I didn't want to pin anything specific on you, because I know that the feeling or the reality of blessing is so contextual. But when you all hear that word, blessed are, what is it that you at least think of? What comes to your mind when you hear about being blessed? Patty?
Insight comes to mind, that to be blessed is to be given more understanding, and to be opened more.
Yeah. So insight was the first word you used. It was a little
Yes.
blippy. Yeah. So insight and awareness and understanding. I think those are very powerful terms. Anyone else? What comes to mind when you hear the word to be blessed? We'll go with Boyce, and then I'll come back to Horty and Carol.
To me, it's God is involved. And it's kind of like the knighting from a queen or king to someone. God is knighting you, blessing you.
That's an interesting way of saying it, because some people would look at God knighting you, or the touch of God, as being something that is, incredibly powerful and lifts you up in a privileged position. But then again, there's the story of the wrestling of Jacob with the angel, and the touch of God is what injures his hip. And so there's that way that we are being touched by God is not one thing. It means that God is radically present, but it doesn't always manifest in a way that's sort of in one particular way. I like that. That God is there, that we are touched by God. Horty, and then Carol.
Blessing is often felt to me as being gifted, that I'm being gifted with something. And when I can look at things that feel adversarial as an equal blessing, because, as Patty says, of insight.
Yes.
Everything is really a gift, but the word blessing often comes to me as a gift. And as you've talked to us previously about our role with God is interactive. And part of the blessing of a gift is being able to receive that which has been gifted.
Yes. And to utilize the gift. A gift bestowed and then not utilized, or not seen, or not, understood, is one then that risks being wasted. And so that's there's that aspect of blessing that is certainly, there's like a responsibility, I think, to a blessing, that our awareness and our acceptance of the gift do not end with us. But as you said, it's this collaborative approach that we serve God and we continue the blessing by paying that forward in one way or another. Carol?
Well, one of the reasons I really wanted to dig into this is I will never forget, we were at a church camp, and the youth pastor, somebody was talking about, hey, I'm so blessed. And when I look at everybody else, I realize I am so blessed because I have so much more than others. And boy, did he go after us, saying, you know what? Don't make yourself feel better by finding someone who's worse.
Yes.
And boy, did that stick with me even to this day.
Well, and that's what we have to be careful of. Thank you for saying that, because that's one of the reasons why the way Luke presents this can leave us in a position that I don't think Luke intends at all. He doesn't write it in that way so that we'll sit back and feel like Schadenfreude, we'll be anticipating those that are laughing now, well, you're going to get yours and I can't wait to see that day. That's not what Luke is talking about. the whole woe to you. It's not. And if we do that, then we're falling into that trap that your professor was just naming, that your class was talking about, Carol. So it's partly what happens, though. We often put ourselves into the position of the ones that are sort of being elevated, and then we look at others as being the ones that are, being spoken to, sort of taken to task. And the truth is, we are all within that. And therein is, I guess, one of the takeaways for understanding blessing is to recognize that we are all of those. There is not difference. Okay, there are times when we are weeping. There are times when we are laughing. Be in them, receive them. Don't judge them. Don't separate. Don't say, oh, this is who I am. This is what shall always be, and say that, well, that's your lot. And that separation stuff, and the way we tend to judge and the way we tend to analyze, and then step out of our awareness and openness and understanding to all that is, it interferes with our ability to really perceive blessing and to be blessing. Horty?
What's coming up for me as you're speaking is don't stay stuck in any one position. Know that each will come to each of us.
Yeah.
And it's great when it's going well. And there's something to be learned from the flip side of the coin. But when you say that we're all of everything, don't get stuck in any one position.
Yeah. And that's something that we all can gain from. There's a universal quality to that, especially in a world in, the ancient Near East, where it was so much more stratified. But let's be honest, it's still very stratified within our society as far as who can achieve and the attitudes we have about certain people, whether it's based on economics or race or religion or whatnot. So these stratifications exist, and just in one general sweeping way, the Beatitudes are a means of trying to break out of some of those tired old molds of looking at our interrelationship with one another and with God. And that's really what Jesus came to eradicate, is those old tired models of how we were supposed to relate to each other and how we're supposed to relate to God. He broke it all down, and it was perceived to be a huge threat. That's partly why, they treated him the way they did. That's why they always treat prophets that way, because prophets are constantly breaking the barriers, the walls that we build to support the institutions and the structures that give us a perception of comfort. These Beatitudes themselves are like little hammers to the walls that we create. And when we look at them that way, I hope will break open and will deepen our appreciation of that awareness and the understanding and the broadness of where we are and how we truly relate to one another. Okay, wow. I'm going to get to all of you, but I'll go with Birdie first, because we hadn't heard from her yet, and then I think it was Horty, Patty, and Marilyn.
I think Jesus is blessing us with his promises, that each beatitude has a promise associated with it.
Yes, and it's not just his promises, Birdie. He's connecting to promises that God has made from the beginning, and we'll get into some of that today. And by the way, I don't know if I mentioned, I said we were going to be doing an introduction. We're also going to cover the first two. Just the first two Beatitudes today. So we'll get into a little bit of what you're saying about how it connects to the past, but also then how it points us to a future, to the continuing promise. So that's very important. But that's really what the Gospels are doing. They're trying to connect the story of Jesus to the greater story of promise that God is, okay, yeah. and the relationship between God and Israel. So yes, well, is it Bob or Horty? Bob. And then Patty, and then Marilyn.
Horty's not this ugly. So
I see that.
Simply put, I think our blessing is that God loves us.
Yeah, and the depth of our awareness of that and what that means, how that guides our life, Absolutely. That's part of it. It's not just an awareness, though. It's not just a head awareness, right? That God loves us. If it stops there, then that's just lip service. That's just to make us feel better. But what is love? It is an enacted, an enlivening to your life. It's what motivates. It's what guides us. So when we know that God loves us, the blessing is that changes the way we live. That orients the way we live. That's the blessing. The blessing really is not just that God loves me, because if that's where it ends, that's really just it just sort of truncates that gift. It's about connecting that to the way we relate to one another. Patty.
I was thinking about what Boyce said about being touched by God. And I was thinking about some of the people that are touched by God, like Martin Luther King or Jesus or St. Francis or any of those folks. And I was thinking that to be touched by God is to be invited to think about what Jesus said about bringing life to us and life more abundant. And that more abundant life, more humanity, that's a real challenge in a world that's telling us to do something else. It's scary. It's really scary to be touched by God that way, to have insight, to be invited into a world that you don't understand yet. I think that's very scary, and to grapple with it, just to grapple with it.
Yeah.
So
and that is the work. That's why the name Israel means one who struggles with God, because that's the work. And if we think that we just in our lives, I would just love to be touched by God, if we go into that with that sort of attitude, like it's like a Midas touch or something, that it just kind of makes everything. Well, actually, the Midas touch is a wonderful example, because we think of that as being such a gift, but then the reality of that, nothing that you touch will live if everything turns to gold. So that's sort of, there's ways that we have to be very careful what we wish for when we consider some of the ways that we approach blessing. And to be blessed and touched by God is quite an undertaking. I wanted to go to Marilyn first, Horty, then I'll come back. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to bring up something that I think is a little different than what we've been talking about, but it becomes more and more important to me. And that is my being appreciative of good things that happen. Because I'm certainly aware of bad things that happen. So I want to know I'm appreciative of good things. And I'll give you an example. Yesterday I was going for my walk, and I was walking under kind of an overhang near Rayleigh's, where I was going to get my latte. And all of a sudden I looked up into the rafters, and here was a little nest with two little, I could almost tear up saying it, two little baby birds sticking their heads out, obviously waiting for a parent to come and feed them, or that's my guess. But I thought, I feel so fortunate that I got to see that I looked up at the exact time where I could see that.
Yes.
And I find myself being that aware all the time. People being thankful to one another. And I overhear it. And I got to hear that.
Yeah. It's a beautiful way of being. And I think you're onto something here. And those that have been talking about this way of awareness, of openness, of deeper understanding, of broader perspective, that is so crucial to the deeper appreciation of blessing. And I really do feel that as we get into even these first two Beatitudes, that is what they're about. That's what they're inviting us to, that place of not separation, but deeper connection. Where I am a part of that. And I'm not just witnessing something that I see, but I'm seeing myself in it. I'm seeing it as a part of me. That way of perspective, that way of really seeing all those interrelationships, that is more along the lines of where this is pointing us than just appreciating, oh, what a great little gift that was to see. Oh, I'm glad I saw that. That just brightened my day. That's not bad. But when we see it with that sense that, oh my gosh, this is always happening around me, and this life and this beauty and this interdependence, what a responsibility that is. What a power that is, that we all share, that my life is contingent on another's life and vice versa. And that's, that way of living and holding on to that, it's just a whole different, it's just a different way, a different approach. And that's partly what Jesus was about, not just with the Sermon on the Mount, but again, this sort of summarizes all of that. But it's true. It's teaching us how not to only be thankful for when we avoid the pain, but to be appreciative of all the beauty that's before us and around us all the time. So let's look at it. This first beatitude. Oh, I'm sorry, Horty, you did have your hand up. Did you want to add one more?
Going back to what you were talking about, being asked to be touched by God, there's great responsibility to that. I have a friend who always says that her grandfather said, when you pick up one end of a stick, you pick up the other end too.
Yeah, we just don't quite know what's going to be on that other end of the stick, and a lot of times we act as if we do. But yeah, Kathleen.
Or as if we don't care.
Or as if we don't care, right?
Well, I've been thinking of these Beatitudes, especially where I am right now, in a much more simplistic instead of analytical way, and how comforting they are. And life is hard. And Perry and I are going through a real hard time. Perry's sister-in-law is young and she has cancer. She is dying by the day. Yet, we're still blessed.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about just coming out of the pandemic and the blessings that every time we found a blessing, we tried to say it out loud. And I love these Beatitudes. I love the Matthew version much more because I like the way in which it's written. But I sometimes think that it's okay, at least it's okay for me, to take it in a simplistic way instead of maybe analyzing it to death.
Yeah, but I mean, I hope that in our analysis, it's not analyzing to death. I hope that it's more analyzing to life. But I do think that you're right in that these are intended to be, he says they will be comforted. Blessed are those that mourn, they will be comforted. It is a means of saying that it doesn't have to be that complicated. But when you get, a lot of times our approach to these, when we hear them, is that we hear them in a certain way. And then that colors the way the simple ways that we hear them. And so our effort to kind of get underneath it a little bit is to just open it up and say, oh my gosh, is that what it was saying? Oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. And that's the intention of that, is not to stay here, but to really let it sink in here. And then really open us to those other ways that we can find comfort and also become sources of it for one another, because it's drawing us to that. These are meant to show us the things that are important to God and how those are so often different than the way our world is structured and the things that we are told are important. So let's look at it. For example, the poor in spirit one. Boys?
I just wanted to say, Matthew's especially is sure full of hope.
I think Luke's is intended to be full of hope too. It's just he's got that more striking, he's using a more sort of oppositional kind of style intended to really try to communicate the same thing. But you're absolutely right. There is a real consolation aspect that comes through in Matthew that is so that it's important for us. It is comforting to read it this way. But let's start with that first one, because this is one that, well, at least in my life, has been presented to me in a different way than I understand it now. For most of my life, I had an understanding of what this meant that is absolutely different than today. So when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," what does that mean to you? What were you taught that it means? Bob?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind, or I would say atheist, someone has no religion.
Yes, a lot of us were taught that to be poor in spirit meant to be sort of weak in faith, that there was this lack, or maybe being prideful, or conceited, that there was this attitude that, blessed are the ones that just, are missing something here, to be poor in spirit, that they had less faith. And I don't think that's at all what Matthew is trying to say here. So if it's not that, or what are other things that you'd heard or that you think that it could mean, Jane?
Well, my translation says instead of poor in spirit, sad. And I guess I've read this Bible and version enough that I think of it as just, whether it's sad, heartbroken, there's a lot of times that you just feel heaviness of spirit. So it's more personal than religious.
And that's sort of, a lot of us were taught that poor in spirit means that sort of sense of lack, that sadness, that not enough faith, that heartbrokenness in terms of our faith. And I just don't think that's what the Hebrew understand, or not the Hebrew, the Greek understanding of this term really is trying to communicate there. Because in Luke, for example, it says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Now, Luke seems to be focusing more on an economic model, but Matthew's is much broader, much different. Here's a connotation that the Greek has in it. Now, this is not settled, okay? This is debated, but it really resonates in me. And that the idea of being poor in spirit, it may have economic aspects to it. It may mean that you're partly, that you know what it means to be poor economically. But to be poor in spirit has to do with one's perspective on life. And that you understand that in one way that you see that you're able to witness to and be open to and to perceive the poverty that is around you. And to recognize the ways that you yourself are wealthy or rich, and the ways that you yourself are impoverished, especially if you can't look around and see the ways that others are lacking. To be poor in spirit means that you are in alignment and you are in connection and community with all of those around you, knowing that we all are at different levels. And to be poor in spirit means not to look at what you've accomplished and say, "Look what I've done this," but it's those types of people that seem to be able to know that the communion and the way that the successes of one are reliant and dependent on all. And there's this interactive dynamic to the way life happens. So to be poor in spirit means that we are capable of being poor in spirit with all, and recognizing where poverty is, where wealth is in our own lives, and seeing it clearly around us, that our lives might not just be about what we can accumulate, so we are insulated, but it's a way of living vulnerably and in connection and in communion with one another that allows us to truly see, and then to act in ways that offer ourselves and what we have in support of those around us. How does that land? Does it, comments on that idea of being poor in spirit? Horty and then Peter.
Spirit has always come across to me as sort of another part of Holy Spirit or breath of God. And to be poor in spirit has always meant to me needing an in-breath. And that I need to breathe in, which reminds me of what you're talking about in terms of interactivity. I need to draw in that which is around me to nourish me on all levels, every cellular level. And then as I breathe out, there's the opposite of that. But I need to breathe in to be appreciative, to be on the receiving end of everything that makes up our world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Peter, did I see your hand gonna go up or?
You saw me agree.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Yeah. With what part in particular?
To feel the poverty, to feel the needs of others, to be aware of that. And I also really intend to place more awareness on my own areas of poverty. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And you know, I look at it as an invitation to empathy rather than pity.
Yeah.
Because empathy is that sense that we are all connected, we are all one. I do not judge you for your poverty. I do not elevate myself for the perceived lack of it, because it recognizes that therefore, we are all connected in that. But pity is that distance that we sometimes put between us and those who are suffering or struggling or who might lack. And so pity is what says, oh, it just sucks to be you. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but that's sort of, and it sort of distances ourselves. This to be poor in spirit is a willingness to enter in empathetically to the reality that is around us, that surrounds us all the time, and to recognize that to live with that broader sense of perspective and a willingness to enter into those places of wealth and poverty within ourselves is to break open an experience of blessing for what it means to live in the world. Now, that might sound complicated, but really it's just about saying that there's no distinction between me and you, and your experience of wealth or poverty is part of what makes life. Okay. And so insofar as I experience wealth, what God is saying is to live with as one poor in spirit means that I am willing to just simply share what I have, for the sense that there's, to create equity, to create balance, to support life, to help others thrive, because I get what I have, not just from my own devices and my own efforts, but because there's a community of support. I am dependent on so many others for those things that I have received. So then I continue that when I recognize that that's the pattern, that's the flow of interrelationship. Marilyn? Oh, you're muted.
That might have been something protective I was doing for what I'm going to say. I have had times in my life where I have been very sad, emotionally distraught, and I haven't always been aware that somebody or something or could feel empathy toward me. And I've kind of tended to shut that off. And so I think there are two sides to this. One, the one you're talking about, and the other from the standpoint of the person who is feeling poor in spirit and really struggling to be able to believe and be open that empathy can come. Empathy can come from God. It can come from other people. And oftentimes I have gotten off the phone after a phone call with somebody, and I thought, oh my goodness, that has turned me around. I just hear somebody who understands what I'm going through.
Yeah.
And I'm turned around as a result of that.
That's right.
And so anyway.
the blessing of inner relationship, the blessing of care and a kind word is incredibly powerful. And, you know, one of the lies that we receive too often in modern society is this rugged individualism, this sense of pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps, all of these things that we're taught that then don't really meet reality. They're not, what helps us thrive in life is much more of what you just described, whether it's a one-on-one inner relationship or a broader community like this one, or even larger. Those ways that our lives are emboldened and enlivened, and we grow our most when we are in deeper community and deeper connection to one another. Okay, and so this first beatitude is in part an invitation to live that way, to remind ourselves that that's what it's more about. It's not about me. It's about us. It's about this different way that Jesus is establishing a community, a family that is not meant to be insular. It's not meant to be what I can get. It's about that shared vision, you know, and that our thriving is always mutual. It's not just about what I'm able to accomplish. So being poor in spirit is a way of stepping into a new perspective on our lives. And it may well be other things too. It could be an economic experience of poverty, but it also could be, you know, those times where I'm feeling poor. I mean, are lacking, you know, in spirit. But it's that perspective of connection that can pull us out. Because if we're left to our own devices and we're feeling, say, the poor in spirit version of like lacking in faith and not having enough and not being enough, that can be all consuming, and that can lead us down into a pit of despair from which it's very difficult, if not impossible, to extricate ourselves by ourselves. To be poor in spirit is to recognize that we can't do it alone, and we've never been able to, whether it's to pull ourselves out of the sorrow or to succeed in life. None of it happens by ourselves. All of it happens in connection with others. And we forget that. We forget that. And in fact, we don't just forget it. We're taught that that's not true. Jesus is saying, no, it is true. It is true. Now live that way. And that's the challenge of the gospel. Live that way. Bob?
Along the lines of you talking empathy for others, often I think about that when I see people who say have less. There, but for the grace of God go I often think that.
Yeah, and that's a powerful place to instill empathy and to build on this perspective. You know, just note within yourselves, you know, how you respond when you see different people, you know, say someone that it might be asking for money somewhere. Do you find within yourselves, or sometimes when someone gets a certain diagnosis, maybe lung cancer, okay, that's a classic one in the sense of, do you find yourself seeking to create a narrative within your head as to why that person got that thing? Or sometimes that happens, and it can lead us to this position of distancing. You know, well, if you hadn't done that, this wouldn't happen. And we start to create these patterns that really, that's not what Jesus is asking us, telling us is ultimate. He's saying, look, if people are experiencing struggle, what a blessed life does is reacts to it in a way of a sharing from a place of abundance and love and compassion. And that as we step into that way of being, it just breaks open our whole way of living. That is itself a blessing, just that perspective itself. That when we can walk in the shoes of another without judging or creating these stories that we sometimes do that create separation, again, that make you distant from me. I feel like Jesus is saying, no, I'm pulling you all in, and I want you as my followers to seek to live lives that do the same. Patty?
I was first a Christian. I was a Catholic. And I was with a group reading the Pope's encyclical on peace. And our group was really struggling to understand what we were supposed to be doing in relation to peace. And it was a time when there was a lot of tension between Russia and the United States. And so, and we lived in the Bay Area, talked a lot about this. And then we said, we need to get close to people who are different than us. So we contacted the Russian consulate and invited him to come to our house and talk. And he came. And we thought we were going to talk about the encyclical on peace. But we started talking about children and family. And we drank vodka together. I was thinking about what you said about Saul and Stephen and Saul's transformation. And it wasn't anything that we thought we would do. We were very intent on talking about the encyclical, but we didn't do that. And we don't know what happened with that guy, except that we were all changed by it. We were changed by not doing what we thought we were going to do and just being people together. And that was really transformative, extraordinary. So.
It's true. And it's because so often what heals us, what transforms us, what helps us to grow is not information. It's not analysis. It's not overly diagnosing things. Look, these are helpful, but what breaks it open is breaking down the barriers and creating relationship and recognizing that, oh, you are me. Not wholly, but I am a part of you. You are a part of me. And that is where the healing happens. That's where we embody what peace can look like, because peace is brave like that. Peace does break down the barriers. It's not always about a certain definition of peace. Sometimes it's marches. Sometimes it's legislation. Sometimes it's doing different things. But peace is courageous to seek out, especially where we're afraid, to seek out those places where barriers might be dispelled, that connection can be created. That's a powerful example, but I think it resonates, and thank you. Let's look at the second one, because we're moving into, let's see, 1:15 now. So let's just look at that. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. We were kind of getting into that area today, so far when they looked at, when we often hear the blessed are the poor in spirit one as a means of almost mourning itself, that there's a sadness there. But this one is very specific to mourning. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Luke's parallel is, blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. And then there's the woe. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Again, don't hear that one necessarily as you're going to get yours, but just hold off on overly judging where your circumstances hold you right now, because we all experience these things. So keep a broader perspective. But what is it when you hear this idea of blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted? What is it that comes to your mind? That's the blessing there. Do I see a hand, Patty? It was sort of off to the side. Oh, no? Okay. Bonnie?
The first thing that popped in my mind was President Biden, who has been through tremendous loss in his life. And he has talked about that, and when he comforts other people, where he has said that there will come a time when you will think of that person that you've mourned so much and you've cried about so much, that will bring a smile to your face, that their memory will bring a smile to your face. And so that over time, you will be comforted by this love and the experiences that you've had with this person, as opposed to in the beginning going through such a devastating loss.
What is the point of mourning?
My first thought was that if you truly mourn someone, that means that you have truly loved them, and that, or you have shared a love, which means something, as opposed to you lose someone, but you weren't that connected to them, so you just sort of move on.
And there's the gift of mourning right there. If there is a blessing, one of the blessings of mourning is the ability to mourn. And that when we really do grieve over someone, it means we really did love them. There's an expression that I think is so true, and that is, a heart that knows how to grieve is a heart that knows how to love. Only if we attend to mourning, only when we attend to grieving, can the fullness of love be revealed. Mourning is not to wallow. You used a beautiful word there, Bonnie. It's to remember. You know, Joe Biden said it within the Hebrew practices of Kaddish. It's for a year that you call the person's name to mind. We remember them, and we celebrate all that they are. Okay, the warts, the imperfections, the joyful moments, the things that make you smile, to be there. The Gospels and the Old Testament, they take mourning very seriously, very seriously. It's painful. It's part of our humanity. And one of the things that's happened in modern society is we have been removed from connection to that pain in many ways. Now, we feel it, don't get me wrong, but you know, because we don't see it, we don't move through it, we don't talk about it a lot of times, we have really truncated, we've really sort of sealed off some of our connection to our deepest humanity because of the way that we move through death and grieving in our society. And there's a way that just the act of mourning and being connected to mourning is itself a blessing. There's much more to this beatitude than that, but that's an angle that is not something we maybe readily see because, well, for a lot of different reasons. A lot of us were raised in families that say, well, we don't cry because, you know, we're a strong family. I don't know. That's a thing for some. Or get over it, that sort of thing. You know, we find ourselves saying that in the small ways. Oh, you banged your knee. Just, yeah, come on, get over it. Be a big boy, be a big girl, whatever. There's a lot of ways that we receive these messages, that to move in and through mourning is something that is, you know, we can do like this much maybe. But come on, you start going too far and it's just too much, too far. You know, we make judgments about it. The Bible doesn't do that. The Bible doesn't do that. And in fact, the stories that lead up to this beatitude, there's one very powerful one where the story of the slaughter of the innocents, which again is, okay, historically in this time, there's not evidence that happened in the way Matthew presents it. But what it connects us to is the story of Moses. Okay, and that time of the 10 plagues and the slaughter of the innocents there. And the way, though, what's very powerful is that passage that Matthew quotes when they flee to Egypt here in at the beginning, when Joseph takes the family to Egypt and they run away. It's this powerful passage that Matthew alludes to. And he says, then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. Look, the literal slaughter of the innocents may not have happened, you know, in that way that historically, but what these people knew is that type of mourning. You know, that passage in Jeremiah is from the exile to Babylon. And it was a time where families were ripped apart, where children were just lost and gone. The people of Matthew's day knew that kind of loss. Okay, so he knew he was tapping into a sense of mourning here. But here's where knowing the scriptures is so crucial, because that story that Matthew quotes doesn't end there. It doesn't end with the mourning, because the next verses are God's response to the mourning and the cries of Rachel. And this is what's important about the Beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn now, because they will be comforted. what God says is, thus says the Lord, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work. They shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, says the Lord. Your children shall come back into their own country. It's saying don't get stuck and don't lose hope that through all of this, there will be, God is, and there will be that comforting that happens. And it picks up a little bit on what Kathleen was saying, that, you know, to really hear these Beatitudes, we don't have to get into the weeds with them, that they can be comforting, you know, just at face value. And sometimes that's the way we need to receive them. But then there's also more richness when we dig into the soil, but hopefully that serves us here in the heart area and not just here in our heads. I've said a lot. Any of your reflections on this particular beatitude? Horty.
When we acknowledge that we are in mourning, which is in our contemporary society very difficult to do. As you say, we're told, get over it, get over yourself, move on with life, get back to work, play with your children. Historically, in some traditions, people were allowed to wear black or wear an armband or wear something that designated that indeed they were in a period of grieving. And to be really mourning is to allow yourself to be comforted by others. And yes, hope will come. But boy, when you feel the depth of mourning, you don't want somebody to say, so brush off your mourning. Hope continues. Hope is something that can be held in the faith of others for you. But blessed are those that mourn, I think also really can bring to our awareness the ability of really acknowledging that which we're grieving the loss of and allowing that to be demonstrated in the world, whether it's by wearing black or a sad face or whatever. But when we allow others to comfort us, then the cycle of mourning can get completed in a different way.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And, you know, it's funny because when you think sometimes, or I wonder if when you think sometimes about the wearing different clothes or different ways that we sort of establish that we are in mourning, that we do less and less of, but I still think are there. Those are not really intended to separate us. They really are, as you've said, meant to draw us in, to allow others to maybe be present with us. You know, one of the powerful things that comes through the book of Job, that his friends did right or well. They came and they sat with him in silence at first. Then they started talking, and that's when everything gets screwed up. But they came and they sat with him. They just were there with him, present as witnesses in that friendship and love, that communion. He allowed them to be, then they were together. There's something so powerful about that. And to be in mourning and to have it be something that we share allows others to be that place of comfort. Now, look, I know there's a lot of ways that we can unintentionally make things harder by sometimes saying certain things, but there's something really profound about that stepping into that perspective of mourning that says, that embraces it. Say, I'm here. And so now you may be with me, because I'm not hiding anything. I'm not fleeing from this. I'm not trying to push it under the rug. This is where I am. That's a beautiful way of being. And you can see then how that connects to that first beatitude. It's about that broader perspective of being in the world and being with one another differently. Birdie?
I see this beatitude as being a little different from many of the others. In many of the others, it's a quality that you want to strive for, but nobody really wants to strive to mourn, you know, but mourning is so universal to all of us. I think it's important that Jesus put this near the beginning of his speech, because I think of those people sitting on the hill listening to him, and they can say, he's really talking to me. You know, they've probably all experienced some kind of mourning. some kind of loss in their lives, and he's really speaking to them. And then you'd be more inclined to go ahead and listen to the rest of his speech.
Well, I think he is absolutely relating to humanity on a broad scale. But I would also contend that to cultivate the ability to mourn within ourselves is a powerful skill. It's a powerful tool that really connects us to the fullness of our lives. I mean, a lot of us go through our lives, and it's a lot of men, but it's a lot of people. And we're just taught that expressing our emotions and feeling our feelings is just not something that is acceptable within certain definitions of masculinity or of just personhood, okay? Because I'm not trying, but we miss out. We lose a part of ourselves if we don't embrace that that's a part of what it means to be alive and to be whole. So I do think that on some level, it is a gift to be able to experience and to welcome mourning, grieving, these parts of ourselves that are, as you say, Bertie, they are there. They're a part of our reality, but sometimes we act as if they're not, or as if we, our relationship to them is, above. And when we separate that, that's where we lose some of the blessing. And I think we lose our ability to then be with others. If we're not able to feel, it comes back to that line, a grieving heart, a heart that knows how to grieve is a heart truly that knows how to love. If we're going to be more present with one another, I think being present to our own experience of grief and mourning is so important. And you can't do that in your head. It's a heart thing. It's like I love that expression when you have these scriptures like the Psalm 23 that are written on the heart because you've memorized them. And it's when the heart breaks that they can then fall in and become these sources of healing, because that's why they're there, but it's that ability to let ourselves enter that space that I think really teaches us empathy. It teaches us compassion. So I hear you. I get it's not that we want to call in mourning for the sake of a dramatic, kind of like that martyr thing I was talking about, where look at me, no, but it's about when we mourn, we really learn the fullness of being human. I couldn't remember if there was other hands up. It's so rich, these different interactions here. Was there someone else that wanted to say something about that second beatitude? The Gospels, Matthew is written in a way that, these beatitudes point us back to what he's talked about, but really they point us forward to the experience of the disciples and what the followers of Jesus will be feeling and finding. And then more than that, these touch on the human journey, the human story. And so go in, as in this next week, if you have the time, or if you feel the motivation to do this, reread some of the texts before this, but then really read these over, both Matthew and Luke, if you can, read them over and kind of just open yourself. Okay, there's a specific context, and then there's this broader thing that I hope we're, tapping into. I feel like you're already doing it, because just the way this conversation just kind of unfolded today and bloomed. But continue to do that work, because I think it has so much, it provides so much opportunity for continued insight and perspective shifting. And, these Beatitudes at the end, and maybe you're already sensing this, they are more than maybe we've often viewed them to be. And you know what? It's okay to see them as we've already always viewed them to be too, right? It's not that what we were taught was wrong. It's just that it's not maybe complete, or it's not the full picture. So hopefully these will continue, in the next 2 sessions, continue to build on that, to deepen that, to enrich that. any closing comments or other things you'd like to say or questions? All right, well, for next week, we're going to be covering the blessed are the meek, those who hunger for thirst for righteousness, and then merciful. So those next three we'll cover. And I will have notes available for you. They will be posted on the church website. And I want to thank you all for your wonderful comments and questions and attentiveness. And I look forward to continuing with you next week. Until then.
Thank you.
Blessings, everyone.